I'm not going to work, Mom. You can support me. That's what parents are for. He said it without hesitation, standing in my kitchen with one hand resting on the countertop I had paid for, in the house I had worked my whole adult life to keep. His tone wasn't joking. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a declaration, bold, careless, and so stunningly ungrateful that for a few seconds I could barely breathe, let alone respond. At that moment, I understood something with a clarity I'd never known before. My son didn't just take me for granted. He had come to believe I owed him everything, simply because I had given him too much for too long. I had raised David alone after his father died when he was only 7. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I skipped vacations, said no to new clothes, clipped coupons like it was religion. I went to every school play, every parent conference, sat in the ER with him when he broke his wrist, and in the principal's office when he lied about his assignments. I was there, always, constantly, unconditionally. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I loved him, because I thought that's what mothers were supposed to do. But somewhere along the line, something had gone terribly wrong. David was 25 now, not a child, not even a young man just finding his way. He had dropped out of community college 2 years in, claiming it wasn't for him. He'd worked a string of part-time jobs, barista, delivery driver, warehouse loader, but none of them lasted more than a few months. He said he didn't like the structure. He preferred to sleep late, scroll through his phone, and tell me he was still figuring things out. And I, exhausted, grieving, and too weary to fight, let it slide for far too long. But that morning, everything shifted. Maybe it was the way he said it, that casual entitlement, the assumption baked into his voice. Maybe it was the way he opened the fridge as he spoke, grabbing food I had bought, not even asking if I needed anything. Or maybe it was simply the fact that I saw my future flash before my eyes. A future of working well into my 70s, while my adult son lounged in the guest room, eating meals I prepared, ignoring job offers, and treating me like an ATM with a kitchen. I'm not going to work. Those words echoed long after he left the room, trailing crumbs and empty confidence behind him. That night, I sat at the table long after dinner, not eating, not drinking, just thinking. I didn't cry. I didn't rant to friends or post vague frustrations online. I did what I had always done when something broke in my life. I got quiet. I examined the pieces. And I started making a plan. David wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. But he had grown up learning that love meant being rescued, that if he fell behind, someone, me, would pick up the slack. And I had done it, time and again. I had been too tired to challenge him, too guilt-ridden about his father's death to say no, too wrapped up in survival to notice how my survival had become his excuse. He had learned that effort was optional because consequences never followed. That was about to change. But I knew this couldn't be a simple lecture or a dramatic ultimatum. David had heard speeches before. He had nodded, made promises, even shed tears, and gone right back to sleeping till noon. If I wanted to reach him, I had to let reality do the talking. And that meant removing the safety net he no longer even noticed. Over the next week, I called a lawyer, not for anything drastic, just to understand my options. The house was mine, paid off. David's name was not on any deed, not on the utilities, not on the mortgage I had spent years repaying. Legally, he was a guest. That was important. I reviewed my finances, my will, and all the accounts that had slowly but steadily drained over the past 3 years, while he searched for his purpose. Then I created a spreadsheet, line by line, of every expense I covered: rent, groceries, gas, insurance, internet. It was staggering. Not because I didn't know the numbers, but because I had never seen them laid out so plainly, so damningly. I took a deep breath. And then I opened a second spreadsheet, titled simply, Exit Plan. I began with boundaries, not emotional ones, financial, logistical, legally sound boundaries. I created a formal rental agreement, modest, reasonable, but firm, listing exactly what David would owe me each month if he wanted to continue living in my home. I printed it. I made copies. I highlighted the date it would go into effect. Then I gave myself a date, 30 days from now. For 30 days, I would act as though nothing had changed. I would smile, nod, cook, clean. I would let David believe he had won, that I had accepted his new role as dependent in residence. He would get comfortable, and that's when I would strike. Because I didn't want revenge in the loud, messy way. I didn't want to scream or throw him out in front of the neighbors. I didn't want a scene. I wanted understanding. I wanted that flash of realization in his eyes when he finally grasped that I wasn't going to carry him anymore, and that no one else would, either. 2 weeks in, he asked if I could pick up some new headphones for him the next time I went to the store. Mine broke, he said. I'll pay you back. I just nodded. I didn't remind him that he still owed me for last month's gas bill. I didn't argue. But I didn't buy them either. The following day, he stayed in bed until noon, then asked if I could make those sandwiches he liked. I made my own lunch, sat quietly at the table, and didn't offer him a bite. He frowned, but said nothing. Small cracks, quiet changes, subtle shifts. Then came the final step. A job offer. Not for him, for me. A friend I hadn't seen in months reached out, asking if I'd be interested in helping run a small bookstore she was opening. Just part-time, a few days a week. A chance to get out of the house, to be around people, to do something outside of motherhood and maintenance. I said yes without hesitation. And I didn't tell David. Because I wasn't going to explain anymore. I wasn't going to ask permission. I wasn't going to wait for him to catch up. I had 30 days to set the stage, and when that day came, my son would learn what it truly meant to stand on his own. Not because I pushed him, but because I had finally stepped aside. The final days of March unfolded with a strange, almost deliberate calm, as though the world outside had conspired to make my silence seem natural, my growing resolve invisible. The trees had not yet blossomed, but they had begun their quiet work, and I, like them, was preparing for a slow, irrevocable transformation. Each morning, I rose before David and walked through the house with practiced intention, noting what needed replacing, what would change, what had to go the moment he was no longer there to question it. I had loved this house for decades, but it had become a monument to imbalance, its walls too familiar with the weight of my exhaustion, its corners steeped in the echo of arguments that never led to growth. David still moved through it like it belonged to him, waking late and shuffling through the kitchen in socks that I had washed, eating cereal I had bought, using dishes I had scrubbed without thanks. He no longer even attempted pretense. No, I'll help out tomorrow. No half-hearted plans to apply for jobs. That morning, he had slumped onto the couch, flicked on the TV, and asked if I'd remembered to buy almond milk, as though I were a grocery clerk rather than his mother. I didn't answer him, not out of anger, but because I had begun to understand that silence, wielded correctly, could be more effective than any outburst. Words, I had learned, only matter when someone is still listening. He wasn't listening. Not anymore. Perhaps he never really had. I went to work that afternoon, my second shift at the bookstore. And as I walked through the small door with its brass handle and delicate chime, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Lightness. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of mental exhale, a release from the endless loop of disappointment that had once defined my days. The store smelled of paper and cedar and faint coffee, and every shelf offered a kind of quiet logic that I had not felt in my own home for years. People came in slowly, spoke softly, browsed with interest. They didn't ask for more than they needed. They didn't assume the world owed them. They said thank you. I told no one there about my situation. I didn't need to. There was dignity in the privacy of it, in building something for myself that had nothing to do with motherhood, obligation, or repair. I was simply a woman learning a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around someone else's failures. Back at home, I continued to make preparations with the same care I'd once reserved for David's birthdays. I drafted a letter, not angry, not emotional, just clear, outlining the changes that would take effect exactly 1 week from the day I planned to deliver it. It stated, in direct but respectful terms, that he would be required to pay rent in full each month, contribute to utilities, and provide proof of job applications each week if he wished to continue living under my roof. If he could not or would not comply, he would have 30 additional days to vacate the property, after which I would proceed with formal eviction proceedings. I didn't want it to come to that, but I was prepared. I printed the letter, placed it in a plain envelope, and tucked it into the back of my drawer. Each time I saw it, I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not pride, but certainty. I wasn't acting in anger. I was acting in preservation, not of my money, not of my time, but of myself. 3 days before the date I had chosen to confront him, I tested the waters. David asked me to spot him for a video game he wanted to download. Just $20, he said, which he would absolutely pay back next week. I looked at him, truly looked. At his face unshaven, his eyes half-lidded, his body draped on the couch like a guest overstaying his welcome. And I said, with the calmest voice I could manage, "No." He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I said again, and this time I didn't fill the silence. I let it expand. He scoffed, rolled his eyes, muttered something about how I was suddenly acting brand new, and went back to his screen. But I saw the flicker of unease, a crease in the confidence, the first delicate fracture. That night, I didn't cook. I made myself a small plate, roasted vegetables and toast, and left him to figure out his own dinner. He waited until after 8 to ask, casually, if I was still making food, and I replied, without turning from my book, "I've already eaten." Another pause. Another shift. The next day, I cleared the guest room, the one he had been using for nearly 3 years as if it were his own apartment. I boxed up my grandmother's old linens, reorganized the closet, removed the framed photos of him as a boy that had once made me feel proud, but now only hurt. I placed those gently in storage, not as punishment, but because nostalgia had begun to feel like betrayal. I didn't want to remember who he had been. I needed to focus on who he had become, and who I could no longer afford to protect. The following morning, I brewed a full pot of coffee and poured myself only 1 cup. I didn't leave him any. He noticed. "Are we out?" he asked, standing in the kitchen in sweatpants at noon. "No," I said, not unkindly. "I made just enough for me." He stared for a second, trying to read the tone, the meaning. But there was no heat in my voice, just truth, plain and quiet and absolute. And when he turned away without responding, I knew the time had come. The letter was waiting. The plan was in motion. And for the first time in my life as a mother, perhaps the first time in my life as a woman. I was about to teach someone I loved that love was not infinite when it went unreturned, that even the deepest well can run dry if someone keeps pulling and never pours back in. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was done. The morning I handed him the envelope was remarkably ordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't wait for a dramatic moment. I didn't choose a stormy night or some obvious turning point. It was a Tuesday. The sky was pale and overcast, and the kitchen smelled of toast and coffee, the way it always did. David shuffled in around 10:30, still in the wrinkled shirt he'd fallen asleep in, rubbing sleep from his eyes like a boy, though there was nothing boyish about him anymore. I waited until he'd poured himself cereal, not bothering to thank me for buying it, of course. And then I placed the envelope on the table between us without saying a word. He glanced at it without much interest at first. I knew he thought it was a bill, or some letter that had nothing to do with him. He didn't reach for it right away. He sat, spooned cereal into his mouth, with the same disinterested rhythm he brought to every part of his day, and only when he noticed that I wasn't moving did he finally pick it up and ask, with that sluggish edge in his voice, "What's this?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't steel myself for conflict. I simply said, "It's an agreement. Your terms for staying in this house, starting next week." He blinked, looked at the envelope again, then at me, clearly confused. Not because the contents were hard to understand, but because the gesture itself was so far outside the version of me he had built in his mind that he couldn't quite reconcile what was happening. He opened it slowly, scanning the first lines, his face shifting from confusion to amusement, to a kind of slow, blooming disbelief. "You're charging me rent?" he said, the last word like it was a foreign concept. "That's right," I said, keeping my tone even. "And utilities. And if you'd like to eat the food in this house, you'll either start contributing to groceries or buy your own. I've itemized everything." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do. He laughed like a child caught misbehaving who assumes the adult isn't serious. "Are you kidding?" he said. "You're my mom. And I've been your landlord, your cook, your laundress, your therapist, your driver, your bank, and your excuse. But I'm not going to be any of those things anymore unless you start acting like a tenant and a man, not a burden." The words landed heavier than I expected, probably heavier than I meant. He dropped his spoon, and it hit the bowl with a dull clink, the milk splashing slightly onto the tablecloth. He leaned back, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "So what? You want me to just— what? Get out?" "I want you to get up," I said. "To get a job, to get a life, to take responsibility. I've carried you long enough, and if you don't want to contribute to this home, then yes, you'll need to leave." The silence that followed was longer than anything we'd shared in months. Not because we hadn't fought before. We had. But because this time, he could tell I wasn't bluffing. There was no heat in my voice, no frustration, just resolve. And he didn't know what to do with that. He scoffed again, trying to hold on to his bravado. "This is insane. You'd seriously kick your own son out?" "I would seriously stop allowing my own son to live off me while offering nothing in return," I replied. "And you'll find that most of the world agrees with me." He stormed out of the kitchen, muttering curses under his breath, slamming the door to the guest room hard enough to rattle a picture frame in the hallway. I didn't follow him. I didn't knock. I simply sat there, finished my coffee, and let the quiet settle back around me. Not triumphant, not smug, just firm, steady, certain. The rest of that day passed in a tense, uneven rhythm. He didn't come out until late afternoon. He didn't say a word when he walked past me in the hallway. He went to the fridge, saw that it was no longer stocked with his favorite snacks, and slammed it shut again. I heard him cursing under his breath, but still I said nothing, because this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about correction. I had allowed something to grow out of proportion, like a weed I'd mistaken for a harmless vine. I had told myself, year after year, that helping him through a rough patch was just part of being a good mother. But what I had done was remove every natural consequence from his path, and then wondered why he never learned to step forward on his own. Now he would learn. Not because I had suddenly stopped loving him, but because I finally understood that real love is not indefinite indulgence. It is structure. It is earned respect. It is the moment you stop handing out forgiveness in advance and begin demanding growth in its place. The next morning, he was already awake when I came downstairs, unusual in itself. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the rental agreement, flipping through the pages with a tight frown. He looked up when I entered, his expression harder, older than it had been the day before. "So that's it?" he asked. "I either pay up or get out?" I nodded slowly. "You can make your own choice, but I won't make it for you anymore." He looked at me for a long time, and I could see the gears turning, not yet acceptance, but the first flicker of accountability, the beginning of discomfort that might one day become maturity. "I don't have that kind of money," he said quietly. "Then you'll need to find it," I said. "Like everyone else." And then I walked past him, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table with the morning paper, letting the silence between us stretch and settle like something new being born. He didn't say another word, but that was the first morning he opened a job listing website without me asking. By the end of that week, something had changed in the air between us. Not dramatically, not even in ways someone from the outside might notice at first glance, but in the subtle, shifting weight of our shared space. David moved differently, slower in the mornings, less entitled in his requests, and though he hadn't said it directly, I knew the confrontation had lodged itself inside him like a stone dropped into still water. He was still sulking, still quiet, still unconvinced that I would actually follow through. But he had stopped asking me to buy things. He had stopped leaving his dishes wherever he pleased. And most importantly, he had stopped pretending that his lifestyle was sustainable. On Thursday evening, just after dinner, which I cooked only for myself again, he stood in the doorway to the kitchen holding his phone awkwardly in both hands. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, and when I looked up from my tea, I saw a flicker of something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not humility, not exactly, but something close to uncertainty. That, for David, was a breakthrough all on its own. "I applied for 2 jobs today," he said, voice flat, eyes cast somewhere near the floor. "Just part-time, at the mall." I didn't respond right away. I wanted to be careful, to hold the line. Encouragement too early might feel like a reward for the bare minimum. And I had spent too many years praising crumbs because I was starving for change. So I nodded once, calmly, and said, "That's a start." He didn't look pleased with my reaction, but he didn't push. He walked away a moment later, shoulders a little heavier than usual, as if some part of him had expected me to crumble, to rush forward with a hug and a thank you, to undo the boundary he had been forced to confront. But I didn't, because I was no longer the mother who rushed in to fix things before he felt the discomfort long enough to learn anything from it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the shower running at 8 a.m., a detail that might have meant nothing in another home, in another context. But in mine, it was practically historic. David, awake, clean, dressed before noon. A miracle. He had an interview that day, he said, with a certain pride in his voice that he tried to mask with casual indifference. I watched him lace up shoes I hadn't seen him wear in over a year, dig through the coat closet for the one jacket that still looked presentable. He didn't ask me to iron it. He didn't ask for a ride. He simply said, "I'll be back later." And when he left, closing the door behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't that I believed everything would change overnight. It wasn't that I thought one job application, one early wake-up, would suddenly transform him into the independent adult I had hoped he'd become years ago. It was that, for the first time in years, I wasn't doing the emotional labor for both of us. I wasn't chasing, reminding, begging, or cleaning up the aftermath of another half-finished plan. He had taken a step, and I had let him. That afternoon, I went to the bookstore. The shift was quiet, the shelves cool beneath my fingertips. I rearranged a display table near the front, paused to chat with an older woman looking for a gift for her granddaughter, and sipped coffee in the back room while watching dust drift through a shaft of sunlight like snow. It was the first time in a long while that I felt fully present, not anxious about what was waiting for me at home, not preparing myself to be the barrier between my son and reality. Just me, in my own life, holding space I had carved out by saying, "Enough." When I returned that evening, David was already home, pacing a little in the living room. He looked up when I entered and gave a half shrug. "Didn't get it," he said. "But they said to check back in a month. I'm going to keep trying." I nodded and set my keys in the bowl near the door. "Good," I said simply. "That's what adults do." He didn't like that, not the tone of it, not the truth buried in it. But he didn't argue, and that was new. Over the next week, he applied to more places. I didn't ask how many. I didn't monitor him or push. I kept my side of the agreement firm. Bills split, receipts saved, and no extra cash handed over. He began making small payments. Not everything, not yet, but enough to show movement. I saw him begin cooking for himself, washing his own clothes without reminders, even taking the trash out without being asked. Again, none of this was remarkable on its own, but in the context of our shared history, it was monumental. He wasn't changing because I lectured him. He was changing because I stopped shielding him from what it meant to live without a mother willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of his comfort. There were still moments of tension. Of course there were. He made a snide comment one evening about how his friends don't have to pay rent to live at home. And I didn't flinch when I replied, "Then maybe your friends' parents are enabling them too." He fell silent after that. He wasn't used to me matching his tone with something sharper, something rooted in truth rather than guilt. One night, he came home late, not drunk or irresponsible, but tired. Really tired. The kind of tired you only understand after a long day of standing on your feet, trying to impress strangers for minimum wage. He dropped his keys onto the counter and looked at me in the kitchen with a weariness I recognized instantly. Not laziness, not avoidance, but the fatigue of effort. "They said I can start next week," he said. "It's not a lot of hours, but it's something." And for the first time in a long while, I let a smile reach my face. Not wide, not exaggerated, but genuine. "That is something," I said. "It's exactly where you're supposed to start." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, opened the fridge, and made himself a sandwich. Quiet, normal, uneventful. But in that moment, I knew. I had not lost my son. I had simply stopped carrying him, and he had finally, mercifully, started to walk. The first week of his new job came with its own form of awkward adjustment. For both of us, David, who had once spent his days drifting between online distractions and long naps with no consequence, now stumbled through the front door each evening with tired feet, the creases in his shirt sharper than the lines under his eyes. His body slouched with the unmistakable wear of someone who had met the demands of the world and finally realized that it didn't care who your mother was. He didn't complain outright, but I could hear it in his footsteps, the slower pace of his evenings, the absence of smugness in his voice when he spoke. Gone was the boy who scoffed at the idea of working for someone else. In his place stood a man, not fully grown, not polished, but finally beginning to understand the currency of effort. I didn't hover. I didn't greet him at the door with 1,000 questions or an over-eager smile. I had spent enough years micromanaging his moods, trying to keep peace by bending myself around his expectations. Now I simply continued my life. I read in the evenings. I went to the bookstore. I took longer walks in the neighborhood, admiring the changing trees and the feeling of air on my skin that I hadn't noticed in years. There was a lightness in me that hadn't come from anyone else, not from approval, not from apology, but from the act of finally enforcing a line I had drawn for my own survival. David began waking earlier, not always on time, and not with enthusiasm, but with purpose. I heard the alarm now, a sound that used to be ignored, followed by the shuffle of him getting dressed, the bathroom door closing, the soft click of the front door as he left for work. On the third morning, I found a note on the counter in his handwriting. Took the bus. Didn't want to wake you. It was small, hardly a grand gesture, but to me, it felt like a shift in the Earth's axis. He had, for once, anticipated someone else's comfort before his own. At the end of that first week, he handed me a folded envelope with 3 $20 bills and some loose change inside. For the groceries, he said, eyes down, tone unsure, like a child handing in late homework. I looked at the envelope for a long moment, then took it without a word. I didn't praise him, didn't turn it into a milestone, didn't frame it with fanfare. Because this bare minimum, was never meant to be remarkable. It was simply expected. And though it had taken years for him to understand that, I wasn't about to make the mistake of praising effort where responsibility should have always lived. Still, that night, I made enough dinner for 2. Not because he had earned it, but because I wanted to. I didn't say anything when I set the second plate down. He noticed. He didn't thank me, but he ate with a quiet that carried more gratitude than words ever could. A few days later, I heard him on the phone with someone, a friend, maybe, or an old co-worker. And though I didn't intend to eavesdrop, my ears caught on a sentence that stopped me in my tracks as I passed the hallway. "Yeah," he said, his voice lower than usual. "It's weird, but I think I needed it. I was doing nothing, man. Literally nothing. And she stopped letting me." There was no resentment in his tone, just confusion, realization, maybe even a flicker of respect. I kept walking, heart heavy and light all at once, because this wasn't just about finances. It was never just about the money. It was about what grows in a person when they're allowed, or encouraged, to believe that their comfort is more important than their growth. I had let him linger in that place for far too long, and in doing so, I had unknowingly become both his safety and his excuse. But not anymore. He came home early one Saturday afternoon, his shirt stained from the stockroom, his hair damp from the spring rain, and offered to help clean out the garage. I had mentioned it weeks ago in passing, never expecting he'd take initiative. But now he stood there, holding the broom, already pulling boxes from the corners without instruction. For 2 hours we worked side by side in a quiet that wasn't tense, wasn't laced with unspoken disappointment. Just the sound of movement, of dust settling, of long neglected objects being sorted into things worth keeping and things ready to be thrown away, much like our dynamic. We didn't talk much, but at one point, as he moved a box of old winter coats, he asked, "Do you think I can fix it? Us, I mean." The question was simple, but its weight was immense. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking if healing was possible. I didn't answer right away. I finished wiping down the shelf I was working on, set the rag aside, then looked at him fully. "I think it's not about fixing," I said. "It's about building something new, and that takes time." He nodded slowly, absorbing it, and for the first time, I saw no flinch, no eye roll, no deflection. Just a young man standing inside the hard truth of his own choices and trying, for once, to build from there. Later that night, I went out alone for dinner. A small place in town with low lighting and good bread. I brought a book. I took my time. I didn't feel the need to text him where I was going or when I'd be back. I wasn't worried about what mess I'd return to. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to the fear that everything would fall apart the moment I stopped holding it together. And when I got home, I found the kitchen clean, the trash taken out, and a note on the counter. "Hope you had a nice night. I'm working the early shift tomorrow, so I'm heading to bed." No flourish, no flowers, no grand apology. Just effort. And at last, that was enough. The days moved with a rhythm now that felt more natural, less strained, as though the house had exhaled after years of holding its breath. David's presence no longer consumed every corner, not because he was gone, but because he had finally started to become smaller in the places he used to sprawl unchecked. His shoes no longer littered the front hall. His laundry didn't pile up in the bathroom like it had been dropped by someone certain someone else would pick it up. And perhaps most telling of all, he had started to ask questions he never used to ask. Not about himself, not about his wants or his frustrations, but about me. It was small at first. A simple, "How was your shift?" when I returned from the bookstore one afternoon, and though I knew it probably hadn't come naturally, that it had perhaps been rehearsed in his head or prompted by something he read or heard, I appreciated it more than I let on. I answered honestly, told him that it had been quiet, that we'd received a new shipment of poetry books, that a customer had asked me to recommend something for his wife's birthday. David listened, not just politely, but actively, with his head tilted slightly and his attention fixed. I had waited over 2 decades for a moment like that. Later that evening, we sat at opposite ends of the living room, each reading. A silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people coexisting, not clashing. He had borrowed a book from my shelf, something by Steinbeck, if I remember right, and I watched him now and then over the top of my glasses, quietly stunned by the stillness in him, the way he no longer seemed to demand the room without saying a word. The job had steadied him. That much was clear. It wasn't glamorous. Retail rarely is. But it was something solid under his feet, and the simple act of having to show up, be accountable, follow through, had begun to shape him in ways that years of coaxing and hand-holding never had. He no longer asked me for money. In fact, twice now he had brought home groceries without being asked. Simple things like eggs and bread, and, on one occasion, my favorite brand of tea. He didn't say anything about it, didn't make a show of his contribution, just placed the bag on the counter and went to his room. But I noticed. Of course I noticed. There were still cracks. I don't want to pretend it was some perfect transformation. He still slept too late on his days off. He still forgot to do his laundry until he had no socks left. He still sighed dramatically when asked to take on a chore that wasn't his idea. But the difference was in the recovery. He caught himself now. He apologized when he forgot. He tried again the next day. I remember one Sunday afternoon in particular. The sun had come out after a long stretch of rain, and I was outside trimming the rose bushes that had grown wild while I'd been too distracted to care for them. David stepped outside and stood at the edge of the porch, watching me for a moment. "Do you want help?" he asked. It was such a simple question. 5 words. But they cut through me in a way I hadn't expected. For so many years I had worked alone, not just in the yard, but in every facet of life, managing the bills, the appointments, the emotional labor. And now, here he was, offering a hand without prompting. "Yes," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I'd like that." He fetched the second pair of gloves and joined me without complaint. And for the next hour, we worked side by side. We didn't talk much. He asked me how to avoid getting scratched, and I showed him where to cut the dead growth. But mostly, we just worked, together. And the space between us felt different, not strained by expectation or guilt, but filled with something far quieter, far older, mutual effort. That night, I found a text on my phone from him. Unusual, considering we were both home. "Thanks for letting me help today. I didn't realize how much you did around here until I started paying attention." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to sit with the feeling of being seen, maybe for the first time by the very person I had raised. When I finally responded, I kept it simple. "Thank you for showing up." He didn't reply, and that was fine. It wasn't a conversation that needed more words. Later that week, I found the original copy of the letter I had given him, the rental terms, the printed expectations. It was in his room, tucked into a file folder alongside a few other documents, a bank statement, a pay stub, a budget he had clearly started on his own. I hadn't gone looking, but I'd been helping him locate a misplaced cable bill, and he hadn't seemed worried about me opening the drawer. That alone told me he had nothing to hide. Seeing that paper again, no longer a threat, but a marker of change, filled me with a bittersweet sense of pride. I hadn't enjoyed drawing that line. No mother wants to draw a boundary that forces their child to sink or swim. But I had done it. And more importantly, I had held it. He had started to swim. Not gracefully, not all at once. But he was moving forward. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Spring deepened, and with it came a kind of renewal that I hadn't expected to feel so personally. The trees outside the house bloomed into that particular brilliant green they only wear for a short while, the kind of green that always looks wet, like the leaves are still deciding whether to open fully or hold their breath a little longer. The air was softer. The light lasted longer. The neighborhood, too, seemed to stir awake after a winter of retreat and indifference. And inside my home, in rooms that had once echoed with unspoken resentment and years of quiet disappointment, I began to feel something return to me that I hadn't realized had been gone. Ownership. Not legal, of course. I had always been the owner on paper, but spiritual ownership, emotional authorship. I had spent years trying to shape a life that kept everyone afloat, sacrificing my own peace for the illusion of unity, feeding the needs of a grown man who refused to accept that time moves forward whether we're ready or not. And now, for the first time, I could see the outlines of my life separate from his. The boundaries I had drawn were no longer theoretical or resented. They were routine, lived, respected, if not always loved. David continued working, and though he didn't speak often about it, I could tell he had grown tired in a new way. Not the fatigue of laziness, but the deep, grounding weariness of someone beginning to understand what it means to earn, to contribute, to wake up, not because he had nothing better to do, but because people expected something from him, and those expectations were fair. He started managing his own schedule. He left sticky notes for himself on the fridge. He apologized when he missed a payment, and always corrected it within a day or two. I didn't ask him for more than he could give, but I also didn't pretend his effort was extraordinary. I let him exist in the space between shame and celebration, the place where real accountability lives. We no longer fought. We also didn't always talk. Some days passed with little more than a nod, a brief exchange of tasks, and that was fine. There was peace in neutrality. After years of drama, silence was a gift. One evening, while sorting old files in my bedroom closet, I came across a photo of David when he was maybe 12, smiling, squinting in the sun, one hand in the air as if mid-wave. It was from a trip to the coast, just the two of us, right after his father had passed. I remembered the way he had clung to me during those months, unsure and scared, and how I had tried to be everything at once: mother, father, shield, compass. I had made promises then, not just to him, but to myself, that I would never let him feel abandoned, never let him fall through the cracks. And yet, in keeping that vow, I had overcorrected. I had insulated him from the very struggles that might have helped him grow. That picture made me ache, not because I missed the boy in it, but because I finally understood what it had cost me to protect him so completely, and what it had cost him to grow up believing protection would never expire. The following Sunday, he asked if we could talk, not in that evasive, hesitant way he once did. This time he stood in the hallway, shoulders square, voice clear. I set aside my book and gestured to the dining room table, the same one we'd sat at when I'd first handed him the envelope. He didn't sit right away. He paced a little, then finally leaned against the edge of the table and said, "I know I was selfish. I know I leaned on you for way too long, and I'm sorry it took this long for me to get it." I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to comfort. I let the words settle. "I'm not just saying this because you made me pay rent or whatever," he continued. "I needed that. I needed something to push against. To stop pretending I was owed something just because you're my mom." His voice cracked slightly, but he caught it, took a breath, finished. "I'm not who I want to be yet, but I'm trying, and I want to start doing more than just paying you back with money. I want to give you your life back too." The weight of that last sentence stunned me more than any apology ever could have. Not because it was poetic or dramatic, but because it was true. For all those years, I had handed over not just money or time, but the shape of my own life. My days, my routines, my sense of identity had been molded around the assumption that his needs would always take precedence. And now he was offering me permission to step out of that role, to breathe in a space that was mine again. "Thank you," I said simply. "That's all I ever wanted. For you to see it. To really see it." He nodded, and for the first time, I didn't see guilt in his eyes. I saw recognition, and with it, a kind of relief. That night, after he went to bed, I walked the house slowly, room by room, light by light. Not because I was checking for messes or chores left undone, but because I wanted to be present with this version of my home, this version of myself. There were still bills on the counter and dust in the corners, and the paint in the hallway still needed refreshing. But there was order. There was effort. There was the hum of something honest, steady, and finally, shared. And for the first time in many years, I climbed into bed without feeling the weight of two lives pressing down on my chest, just my own. And it was more than enough. By early June, the rhythm we had found, that careful balance of mutual distance and quiet cooperation, had solidified into something that resembled peace. Not the kind of peace built on avoidance or politeness, the kind I had lived in for too long during David's driftless years, but something sturdier, something earned. He rose earlier than I did most days now, usually for his morning shifts, his keys jingling as he passed through the hallway, his footsteps deliberate but not apologetic. I would find a clean sink most mornings, the trash tied neatly by the door, and occasionally a scribbled reminder note to himself or a receipt folded neatly near the fridge. He was not transformed, but he was transforming. Slowly, visibly, and without performance. And in the space he had left behind, the emotional space I had once filled entirely with worry, management, and silent disappointment, I began planting other things. Literal things, yes. Tomatoes in the backyard. A few stubborn hydrangeas along the fence that I'd always loved, but never felt I had the time or patience to nurture. But more than that, I began to reclaim the quiet I used to fear. I stopped listening for signs of disaster. I stopped interpreting silence as a threat. I learned how to sit alone again, not as someone abandoned or burdened, but as a woman who had finally chosen herself after decades of being the default solution for someone else. I read more now. I cooked only what I wanted. I picked up old hobbies I had shelved when David entered adolescence, and my life became a series of errands, damage control, and emotional triage. I joined a watercolor class at the community center. I started walking every evening without telling anyone where I was going. No one needed to know anymore. I wasn't being watched. I wasn't being waited on. I had time that didn't belong to anyone else. One afternoon, I was in the backyard trimming the herbs when David returned home early. He came out to where I stood, not with the hesitation he used to carry whenever he wanted something, but with a kind of quiet ease. He offered to help me repot the lavender that had outgrown its container, and he didn't just offer, he actually did it. Hands in soil, sleeves rolled up, quiet but engaged. At one point he looked at me and asked, "Did I ruin things for you? I mean, do you ever wish I hadn't come back here after college didn't work out?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was painful, but because of the way he asked it. Without defensiveness, without a hidden edge, just plain curiosity, like someone finally willing to hear the answer even if it hurt. "No," I said, pressing gently into the roots of the plant. "But I do wish I had said no to you more often. I wish I'd let you fall a little sooner. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to let you stay stuck." He didn't respond right away. He just kept working, head bowed, fingers covered in soil. "I get it now," he said quietly. "I didn't then, but I do now." And I believed him. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the back window, watching the light drain slowly from the sky, turning everything soft and amber. The house was still, not in the way it had once been, heavy with tension or silence loaded with resentment, but genuinely still, like something had finally settled into its rightful place. I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I wasn't waiting for him to regress, to undo what little progress he had made. Because I had accepted, fully, that if he did falter, it would not be my job to catch him. My role had changed. My identity had stretched. David was still living under my roof, but he no longer lived at my expense. One Sunday morning, as I was making coffee, he wandered into the kitchen holding a few printouts in his hand. He explained, not eagerly, not nervously, that he'd been looking into certification programs. Something with logistics or inventory, a path that might offer more than hourly work. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't gush with praise, and he didn't look for it. He just wanted me to know. I gave him the same calm, measured support I had once been so desperate to give, but this time with a different energy. Not with hope disguised as fear, not with conditions tucked behind every word. Just, that sounds like a smart step. It was a new kind of relationship, one I wasn't sure we would ever reach, and it felt, in the truest sense, mutual, not equal in all ways. Perhaps it never could be, but balanced, respectful, rooted in reality instead of fantasy, effort instead of excuses. By midsummer, I started sleeping better. I didn't wake in the middle of the night anymore, heart racing, mind spiraling with worries about unpaid bills, looming failure, or the years I had lost being someone else's scaffolding. I began dreaming again, not metaphorically, but literally, soft, strange dreams that belonged entirely to me. Dreams about water and open fields and houses filled with light, because I had finally come home to myself. And I no longer lived with the quiet grief of loving someone who refused to grow. Now I lived with someone who was trying, and that, at last, was enough. July brought heat that pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick and unrelenting, the kind of heat that made the whole house slow down. The curtains stayed drawn longer in the mornings. The floorboards were warm underfoot by mid-afternoon. And yet, despite the discomfort, there was something almost sacred in how still everything felt. No chaos, no raised voices, no tension lurking behind every minor inconvenience. Just a home returning to itself. David's schedule had grown more consistent by then. He was working more hours, sometimes coming home late, his shirt sticking to his back, his shoes scuffed and tired. But I noticed the change not in how he moved, but in how he behaved when he stopped moving. There was no more flopping on the couch with exaggerated sighs, no more complaints about being worn out after doing the bare minimum. Instead, he came in, put his things away, asked if I needed anything before retreating to his room. Sometimes we sat together in the kitchen for a few minutes before bed, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. The silence between us was no longer loaded with things unsaid. It was easy, comfortable. He even began paying his portion of the rent before I had to remind him. Not on time every time, but close. The effort was unmistakable. It wasn't about money, and it never had been. It was about awareness, about respect, about acknowledging that living in someone else's home, consuming their space, their labor, their peace, came with responsibility. He had started to carry that weight, little by little, without being prompted. That was all I ever wanted. One evening, he surprised me. We were sitting at the kitchen table, a fan buzzing quietly in the background, and he said, "I was talking to a guy at work. He's doing night classes while working full-time. Says it's hard, but worth it. Makes me feel like I've been wasting so much time." I didn't say, "You have been." I didn't have to. He already knew. Instead, I asked him, "What are you thinking of studying?" He shrugged, but it wasn't the old, lazy shrug of evasion. It was thoughtful. Something practical. Maybe supply chain stuff, or business admin. I don't know. I don't want to be stuck forever. I want to be able to move out. Not because you're pushing me, but because I want to. Those words, because I want to, landed heavier than I expected. I had never asked for repayment, never demanded loyalty or gifts or penance, but I had waited, year after year, to hear a sentence like that. One that came not from shame or obligation, but from agency, from awareness, from maturity. "You'll figure it out," I told him. "You're not where you were. That's already something." He nodded and didn't say more. We sat a while longer, sipping tea and listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling around us. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt profound. I had spent years trying to pull him toward change, only to discover that growth couldn't be dragged into someone. It had to root itself, quietly, on its own terms. Later that week, I came home from the bookstore and found that he had mowed the lawn. Not poorly, not halfway. He had trimmed the edges, cleared the walkway, even swept the porch. No note, no performance. He did it because it needed doing. It seems like such a small thing, and maybe it was. But to me, it felt like the truest marker of progress. Not the grand gestures, not the long conversations, but the invisible work of showing up for your life without being asked. And I noticed something else, too, in myself. I had stopped bracing for disappointment. I no longer rehearsed confrontations in my head or tiptoed around his moods. My time was mine again. I made weekend plans without guilt, took long drives with the windows down, went to the movies alone. I wasn't living around him anymore. I was simply living. I wrote again, not just journaling, but short stories, essays, fragments of thoughts I had pushed aside for too long. I even submitted a piece to a small local publication, something about midlife reinvention, about what it means to reclaim yourself, not with fireworks, but with quiet defiance. They published it. And when I showed David the issue, he looked at the byline, blinked, and said, "You wrote this?" I did. He paused, then said, "That's really good. You should write more." It meant more than he could have known. Not because I needed his validation, but because it was the first time in years he had seen me as someone separate from himself. A woman with a voice. A woman with a name beyond Mom. And in that moment, I realized something that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't angry at him for the years I lost trying to compensate for what he wouldn't do. I wasn't angry at myself for the way I enabled it. I had stopped waiting for an apology big enough to balance the weight of those long, heavy years. Because I didn't need an apology. I had my peace. And he, at long last, had his path. The summer drew to a close with a kind of slow, golden finality, long evenings that lingered just a little longer, the sky hanging onto its colours as if unwilling to let them go. The cicadas buzzed later into the night, and the porch, which had once been the backdrop of so many restless evenings filled with frustration or numb fatigue, had become a place of quiet reflection. I would sit there most nights with a cup of something warm, sometimes tea, sometimes wine, and just listen to the stillness, to the sound of my home breathing around me like something finally settled. And it was in that stillness that I realized just how far we had come. David wasn't just working. He wasn't just paying rent or helping with chores. He was living a life, not passively, not in borrowed time, but with real ownership. He had registered for evening classes at the local community college, 2 nights a week, and I watched as he began arranging his schedule to accommodate both his job and his studies. He bought his own books. He set his own alarm. He even started using a calendar app. The same young man who used to forget his own appointments unless I reminded him 3 times. I had to laugh the first time I saw him studying at the table with headphones in, pen between his teeth, brow furrowed in concentration. He looked like someone I had never met, and yet someone I had been waiting to meet for years. We didn't have a big moment. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reconciliation, no triumphant declaration of transformation. That wasn't how this story was meant to go, and honestly, I didn't want it to. The beauty of what had happened, what we had both allowed to happen, was in its quiet, steady accumulation of change. The shift in a glance, the follow-through on a promise, the way he now knocked gently on my door to ask a question, instead of assuming he could burst in, the way he cleared the table without being asked, the way he said, "Thank you," when I passed him a plate or a towel. The bitterness I had carried, all those years of silent resentment, of burying my exhaustion under a smile, had dissolved not because he had begged forgiveness, but because I had let go of the role I had clung to for far too long. I was not his crutch anymore. I was not his excuse. And in stepping back, I had given him the space to step forward, awkwardly at first, but now with something resembling confidence. One evening in late August, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, casting everything in the kind of amber light that makes you feel like you're inside a memory before it's even passed. David had just come home from class, his bag slung over his shoulder, sweat still clinging to his brow. He dropped into the chair next to me with a sigh, not of complaint, but of honest fatigue. "You know," he said, "I used to think you were just always going to catch me." I didn't speak. I let him find the rest of his words. "And when you didn't, when you handed me that envelope, I hated you for it. I thought you were giving up on me." I turned toward him, not harshly, just directly. "And now?" He looked at me, eyes steady. "Now I know you were finally loving me the right way." I swallowed hard at that, not because it hurt, but because it landed so cleanly, so exactly. He wasn't trying to absolve himself. He was simply acknowledging the truth. "I should have seen it sooner," he added. "We both should have," I replied. And we sat there, letting the silence say the rest. A week later, he told me he was planning to move out, not immediately, but soon. He had found a small apartment near the college campus, nothing fancy, but affordable, and he wanted to live with a friend from work who was also studying. He told me gently, respectfully, as if expecting some part of me to resist. But I didn't. I smiled, I nodded, and I told him what was true. "I think it's time." When he left, weeks later, with a few boxes and a borrowed truck and a slightly crooked smile, I didn't cry. I didn't collapse into some maternal grief. I helped him tape up the last of the boxes, handed him a sandwich I'd made for the road, and kissed the side of his head as he ducked out the door. He thanked me, awkwardly, sincerely, and I watched as he drove off. Not like a boy running from responsibility, but like a man finally heading into it. That night, I stood in the hallway outside his now empty room. It was quiet, clean, the bed stripped, the desk bare. I didn't go in. I didn't sit and remember. I just stood there, acknowledging the space as what it was now. A room, no longer a burden. A chapter, no longer a trap. I went to bed early, windows open, the breeze lifting the edge of the curtain like a hand. And for the first time in years, I felt fully, entirely, alone, but not lonely. No, I was filled with something far more lasting, the quiet, earned satisfaction of knowing I had done what I needed to do, not just for him, but for me. I had taught my son to stand, and in doing so I had remembered how to walk away, without guilt, without regret, just grace.